Boris Johnson has won the UK's Brexit general election, having roundly defeated the opposition Labour Party. You have to go back to the 1980s to get a Conservative majority this big. The Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has now said he will step down. So, what does all that mean for Brexit? And can Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, deliver on his promise to get Brexit done? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special Inside Story coming to you today from Westminster here in central London. Boris Johnson knew he had to win and win big, and win big he did. The Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, only had to get enough seats to form some sort of loose coalition with the Scottish Nationalist Party up in Edinburgh. They didn't even get close to managing that. So Jeremy Corbyn has now said he will go. He'll probably hang around, however, until April. But Boris Johnson says he can deliver on Brexit. That process, in theory, can and should, he says, kick off straight away, with Brexit beginning to happen in January, with a trade deal in the can, done and dusted, by the summertime. His critics say that's impossible. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Rory Challens sets up our discussion.
After his election triumph, Boris Johnson performed the formalities of power in this country, cleared streets, expensive cars, and a police escort to Buckingham Palace. Queen Elizabeth II has asked him to form the UK's next government. The Conservatives have secured their biggest majority since 1987. Johnson and his supporters are jubilant.
Well, my friends, good morning, everybody. My friends, well, we did it. We did it. We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock. We ended the gridlock. We smashed the roadblock. And with this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention.
He's very aware that this victory wouldn't have happened without many Labour voters swapping sides.
Your hand may have quivered over the ballot paper as before you put your cross in the Conservative box. And you may intend to return to Labour next time round. And if that is the case, I am humbled that you have put your trust in me.
From the moment the exit poll predicted an unexpectedly large swing to the Conservatives, the tide flowed in Johnson's favour. Blythe Valley in northern England became the first Labour seat to fall. The Conservatives won there for the first time since 1950. The trickle became a torrent of working-class, former industrial heartland seats turning Conservative blue.
Do you think you'll resign? Thank you very much.
Labour figures look stunned at the catastrophe engulfing them. Leader Jeremy Corbyn is bowing to the inevitable. He will not be in charge for much longer.
I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection on this result and on the policies that the party will take going forward.
It's been a bad night for the pro-Remain Liberal Democrats too. Their leader, Jo Swinson, unseated by the Scottish National Party in her constituency.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
But some commentators worry about the tactics employed by the Conservatives in this campaign.
Boris Johnson used all the tricks in the book, and I guess it's worked. I worry that every future political party will say that's the way to do it if you want to win, and that actually over time will undermine our democracy and our ability to actually discuss big issues.
Labour must now go through a period of deep and painful self-analysis. Corbynism has been tested twice and it's failed twice. Johnson's victory means the UK will almost certainly leave the EU by January 31st. He can get Brexit done. But what kind of Brexit? In reality, Brexit has barely begun.
Johnson's withdrawal agreement has a clear path through Parliament, but unless the threat of a no-deal Brexit is to return, he has to secure an EU trade deal before the Brexit transition period finishes in a year. Trade deals that big usually take many times as long. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, London.
OK, there we are. Here we go. Let's get the thoughts of those guests. Joining us here in London, Kevin Craig. He's the media advisor and donor to the UK Labour Party. Giles Kenningham, founder of Trafalgar Strategy and former director of communications for the UK Conservative Party. And in Staffordshire, Gemma Looms. She's a teaching fellow of comparative politics at Keele University. A warm welcome to you all. Giles, coming to you first. Boris Johnson called working people in this country drunks, criminals and feckless. They voted for him hugely. What's going on?
I think what you've seen, certainly in the short term, is a fundamental realignment in British politics. And I think what was striking from this election, I think it took on a lot more of a presidential tone. It was a two-party race. You saw the challenger parties fall apart. And to some extent, in very different ways, you can draw parallels with Donald Trump. Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, very disruptive politicians. They've ripped up the political playbook. And the normal conventions went out the window during this election. Just look at it in the way he dealt with the media, bypassed some of the main interviews, went straight to market using things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and was incredibly effective. I also think, though, what people need to understand is after the 2017 election, there was this narrative that kind of developed that Corbyn won, but he didn't win. And if he didn't win then, why was he going to win this time? It's like people don't want egg and chips, don't try and serve them more egg and chips. So I think fundamentally it's that. I think the question now for Boris is obviously he has been given this mandate, but what does he do in terms of a domestic agenda, which has been sorely lacking over the past 3 or 4 years?
Kevin, what does it say about Brexit and what happens with Brexit, that this kind of very simple message, make America great again,
get Brexit done,
get Brexit done, gets you back into number 10?
Well, these simple messages work, and Labour didn't have a message or a leader that could compete with what Boris put forward. I am still staggered this morning that a Prime Minister who ran into a fridge when he was asked to answer questions by journalists, who snatched a mobile phone because he didn't like the pictures he was being shown of hospital wards, has been re-elected with such a mandate. But, there's no getting round this. Labour couldn't handle the Brexit challenge, where Labour did really well. I mean, I saw amazing campaign scenes yesterday in London. It's because it was Remain territory with clear Remain messages. But in the Midlands and up north, people were still, they wanted their vote in the referendum respected, and we didn't have an answer to that. And on top of that, it has to be said, Jeremy Corbyn, a very decent man who's done many good things in his life, but people weren't convinced by him, and we got found out in too many areas.
Gemma Looms, up there in Staffordshire, what does this say and what does it do to Brexit?
In terms of Brexit, it means that we finally have a little bit of certainty. It means that Boris Johnson finally has a sizable working majority that he can use to ensure that his withdrawal deal gets through Parliament before the 31st of January 2020 deadline. And there's also another point to the Brexit issue as well, that Boris Johnson now has a united party behind him. Every single one of the Conservative candidates in this election promised to vote for Boris Johnson's withdrawal deal if they were elected to Parliament. So Boris Johnson is dealing with a very different Conservative Party in a very different Parliament now, and he will make good on his promise of getting Brexit done and at least ensure that Britain leaves the European Union by the 31st of January. It then means that we enter the transition period, and Boris Johnson will have to negotiate with the EU in terms of securing a trade deal before the end of December 2020. Otherwise, there could still be a no-deal Brexit at the end of that.
Giles, what does it tell us about Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, and also Boris Johnson, politician? Because Europe as an issue did for Margaret Thatcher, did for John Major, did for David Cameron. David Cameron said, if I lose the referendum, I won't resign as Prime Minister. Oh, he resigned as Prime Minister. He said, I won't resign as an MP. He went as an MP as well. But Boris Johnson kind of sucked out some DNA from the Brexit Party, injected himself, and has turned the Tory party into the Brexit Party light, maybe?
Well, certainly he's got a strong mandate now, I think, in terms of negotiating with Europe. As Kevin said, what was coming up on the doorstep, people were like, just get this done. We want, our vote to be respected. I think for Boris now, though, the really hard work begins. We just talked about a trade deal. I mean, trying to get a trade deal in a year would be unprecedented. The EU-Canada deal took 7 years. So he's going to have to really blow it up with the EU. But this does strengthen his negotiating hand with them. He needs to go in hard, needs to go in fast. And crucially now is they need to get the right people on board for this trade deal, like someone like Stephen Harper, the former Canadian Prime Minister, and they've been talking to him about getting him on board. He's got the expertise. That bandwidth and knowledge doesn't exist in Whitehall. And so, It's how do you deal with the EU? What you've seen so far in these negotiations is when it's very protracted, they weigh you down. So he's going to have to go in with a shock and awe strategy to try and get this over the line.
Who do the Corbynites blame next? Because they will, won't they? That's what Labour does in this kind of situation.
Well, I think Labour has to make real its pledge to have a period of reflection. This is so bad, I'm almost struggling for words, right? The worst result for the Labour Party since the 1930s. Seats like Sedgefield, Tony Blair's former seat, going over to the Conservatives. Durham, this is just seismically bad. And I think the Labour Party needs to take time about what happens next. Because, you know, we mustn't normalise what's just happened. And the way that Giles is just talking there, Boris Johnson, you know, has managed to get this mandate. We don't even know how many children the Prime Minister has got, right? His campaign has had a load of money from all sorts of sources across the world. And yet somehow, as Giles has said, they won. Now, what does that say about where we are as a country? How bad was our overall offering as Labour that we couldn't beat that? I mean, really? So someone called it this morning, who I respect in London politics, Labour's existential crisis. And that's where we are at.
And I think it will take, you know, at least 2 cycles for them to get back into power.
I don't agree. Very briefly,
I don't agree.
In your opinion, very briefly, in 20 seconds, are we in a situation where the next good, in inverted commas, and I'm not editorialising or being political, the next good Labour MP who becomes a Labour Prime Minister maybe isn't even in Westminster at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't agree with that. I think Boris is going to find that actually governing and getting this right and dealing with the fact that around this country you've got so many new Conservative MPs who are representing areas full of people living on the breadline, in poverty, you know, and having to deal with the social consequences of his policies. I think he's going to run into trouble, but we have to wait and see, right?
Gemma, can you help us unpack some of the numbers? If we get a little bit granular about what we know about the vote so far, I mean, there are still 1 or 2 latecomers to come when it comes to the actual constituencies and who they're returning. But the votes for Remain parties across the constituencies that we have to date come down to 52%. The votes for Leave parties come down to 48%. You're smiling, you know where I'm going. In the televised debate, it was 52-48 for Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn. 3 and a bit years ago, it was 52-48. What is it with those numbers and the British political scene that we come down to this kind of, quite honestly, wishy-washy way of doing things? It's always roughly 50-50.
I think it just shows that we're still an incredibly divided country, and we're not only divided over Brexit, we're divided over sort of cultural and identity issues now. And that's one of the key features of this realignment that Giles mentioned, that it may only be a short-term realignment, but we've seen a significant shift in terms of the traditional patterns of British politics at this election. Traditionally, we know Labour are the party of the working class. The Conservatives are traditionally the party of the middle class. But we saw polling data leading up to this election that was showing the Conservatives consistently around 15 percentage points ahead of Labour in terms of their share of the working class vote. So we knew that this sort of breaking down of the red wall across the north of Wales, across the Midlands, across the north of England was coming. We weren't entirely sure if it was going to translate into a large majority for Boris Johnson, but we certainly knew that the Conservatives were making significant inroads into previous Labour heartlands. So it does signify a really significant realignment in terms of the way that British politics works. But we're still very, very divided. The realignment now isn't necessarily in terms of economics, it's more in terms of values. And Labour supporters in the north of England really feel as if the Labour Party no longer shares their working class values. They're a party of the big cities, they're metropolitan, their support base is largely down in London now, and the party just simply doesn't share their values. The Conservatives, meanwhile, with their values of trying to limit immigration, strong law and order, national security, quite a nationalist rhetoric, is a perfect match for a lot of the traditional Labour heartlands.
But also, we were being told, Giles, that this was going to be the election of the woke generation. Younger people, female, people of colour, they're socially engaged, they've got high social media platform occupancy rates, and yet that didn't happen either. You can't say, if you break down the demographics, you can't say this was a young person's election.
No, I don't know what the exact turnout was for some of the young people, but certainly that didn't didn't materialise at all. I think it has been astonishing in terms of what you've seen, I think, is that it's a constant campaign. And what I mean by that is the news cycles just keep moving faster and faster and faster. So every time you might have thought one part, I thought a couple of times Tories had a couple of moments where it looked like they could come unstuck. The news cycle will just take over. And I think it is this constant state of campaigning. But that's also why the micro-targeting of using Facebook is more and more important, because something is correct for a couple of hours.
Was that part of the narrative as far as Boris Johnson was concerned? And your guy, Mr Corbyn, couldn't keep up because, to pick up on your idea about Trump, Boris Johnson does that very Trumpian thing of, oh, it's 6 a.m, we're going to hit them with this, we're going to push that advert out there, we've got somebody on the Today programme, they're going to go blah, 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 and then move on to the next photo op.
Well, I actually think that Labour, and we could debate this all day, I think Labour actually had a very good digital campaign. But if you look at the seats where Labour really ran into trouble, and it's a good point Giles flagged about turnout, as a broad example, you're looking at some of these Midlands northern seats, 62% turnout, 65%. Large numbers of people gone missing. In the seats where Labour had really good results in London, where I saw a lot of the results last night, with generations of new, young, dynamic, black, female MPs, turnout 75, 76%. And that's the issue. I think that Labour had a very good digital game, but I think that went over the heads of a lot of the people in West Bromwich East, where, of course, we didn't help ourselves by selecting terrible candidates. But, we missed this. There is a real issue. I think it's a really well-made point about the working class traditionally and how we talk to them about aspiration and the next generation having a better life than the previous one.
Gemma, let's discuss that idea of aspiration for a second. Are we talking about a situation now where Boris Johnson has got to kind of get ahead of the curve that might come in as a reaction after the honeymoon period, when he has to say, actually, maybe I can't hit the July deadline for getting it all done and dusted? And he's also, from a domestic point of view, he's got to be seen to be improving the lives of those people who have never voted Conservative ever and probably never will ever again.
Exactly, and that's the really interesting perspective for the Conservatives from this election, is that they have gained a significant number of seats that they have never gained before in their history. People have voted for the Conservatives in this election that would never have even considered thinking about voting Conservative before. So in many ways, Boris Johnson has got a 5-year term. He's got to prove that he's worthy of those votes and the trust that people have put in him.
Giles, do you understand it when people say of him, his critics say he's not a one-nation Conservative, his critics say he's a one-nation coward. He had 21 one-nation Conservatives, he in effect sacked them, and their critics say they've crawled their way back into the party now.
Well, look, he's been given a mandate by the British people. I do think the challenge for him is how does he govern as a one-nation leader? And, you've often heard him talking about levelling up. You hear about the Conservatives talking about rebalancing the economy. You've had the Northern Powerhouse idea. This is really his chance, and he has got to prove that. And I think what you probably will see is more of Boris Johnson's liberal tendencies coming out, a bit like when he was Mayor of London. He'll tack back to the centre. Given he's got such a strong mandate from the party now, he wasn't need to be held hostage by those so-called hardcore 20 ERG MPs. And
Do you think he believes in Brexit, Boris? Do you think he actually has always thought Brexit was a good idea?
Well, I don't know. It's a question you have to put to it. I mean, I think I don't know. I really don't know the answer.
Let's talk about the home nations and Northern Ireland for a second. When Nicola Sturgeon from Edinburgh gets on a plane, comes down, goes to Number 10 and says, Mr Johnson, I want a referendum and I want it this year.
He'd be crazy.
Hang on. And given the numbers, how they are going to stack up in her favour, how can he say no?
But look, she had her once-in-a-lifetime referendum in 2014. She can't just rerun the referendum because she didn't like the result the first time. And, look, he would be crazy. I was in government during that referendum. It's one of the most fractious, divisive, poisonous referendums. He would be crazy to grant her another referendum.
Why?
Because of all the reasons I've just laid down the table. And also, does this country need another referendum after we've seen what's happened over the past 3 years? What we need is a period of stability and calm, and for him to carve out a very distinct domestic agenda.
But surely the optics surrounding what Nicola Sturgeon wants now are completely different to... OK, I mean, I take the point about, yes, people don't want to go to the polling booths again, but this is a referendum in Scotland. It is a different country.
Yeah, it is, but I mean, there's a lot of alignment on this in other parties. The Scottish referendum, it was a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation vote. What the British people showed, much as I am unhappy about it, is they don't want reruns of big referenda. And yes, the SNP, it's their one sort of their main policy, but we are a country as a whole, and we took that decision. Scotland took it back then. It wasn't as the first out. It wasn't the best of three.
Gemma, coming back to you, it looks like for the first time in ever, we're going to get more nationalists than unionists out of Northern Ireland. Break that down for me. How significant is that, and why is it happening?
It's one of the trends of the election, really, isn't it? I think we could probably argue that nationalism is a strong trend, not only in England, in terms of sort of Boris's English nationalism, but also in terms of Scottish nationalism doing significantly well as well. And as you said, the first time that a majority of seats in Northern Ireland have gone to nationalists. I think we need to see it within the context of the unionists as well, the performance of the DUP in terms of their confidence and supply deal with Theresa May and the way that they have supported Theresa May's Brexit deal. I think that they've been punished to a certain extent for their role in that, particularly with Nigel Dodds and the Westminster leader of the DUP losing his seat. So we can see significant shifts occurring in terms of the rise of nationalism in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and to a certain extent in England as well. So it's not something that's limited just to Northern Ireland. It's something that's far more a UK-wide trend. But it does have significant consequences for the Union. As a Conservative and Unionist Prime Minister, it would be almost unheard of to think that Boris Johnson could grant Nicola Sturgeon a Section 30 order to hold another referendum. But the SNP would argue that they have a significant mandate. Boris Johnson would probably come back and say, actually, you still didn't receive over 50% of the votes in the general election in Scotland. But Sturgeon will certainly be keen to say that they have the democratic mandate to take control of their own future. And that's a very, very compelling argument.
If you were still near the ear of the Prime Minister and he was saying to you, I'm going to phone the DUP today, because he's got to have that conversation at some point, because his predecessor, Theresa May, gave them a bucket of money to get them on board. She bought political kind of floating around and survival. What's the conversation he should have?
Well, I think they've got to keep good to their word. But, I mean, obviously he doesn't need them anymore. I think the ultimate takeout from this is that hopefully he can govern a lot stronger. I mean, I remember moving from being in a coalition government to a majority government, and the difference is just immense. You know, you can move quicker, it's more stable, you have less leaks coming out of the government, there's a clear, distinct agenda. And sometimes in politics, I think, 20% of decisions, they can go either way. It's more about making the decision, and he's got that mandate and he can do that quickly. And you speak to people around Boris Johnson, say, the one thing about him is incredibly decisive, and that's what we need. We need decisions to be made, because so many decisions have been shelved or put on hold during this whole Brexit impasse.
Kevin, what's the big first immovable object that he's going to come up against when he says, OK, I've won the election, I'm back in number 10, I'm going to do it now, get Brexit done?
He doesn't have any facing him, because he's won with the numbers, OK? He commands Parliament in a way that we haven't seen for decades. He has a party united behind him. Labour, our parliamentary Labour Party, is going to be in a state of high anxiety and reflection over the coming period. The Labour Party's priorities are trying to get commitments on welfare, on public spending. But Boris Johnson, this is why this is so depressing, and it could have been so avoided. He has the numbers. He has the numbers to drive through his agenda.
Gemma, do you agree with that analysis? Also, is it easier for him, not just because he's got this big majority now, when he stands up at the dispatch box, Labour are going to be in disarray, the Lib Dems are going to be in disarray, so he can really, really push for what he wants?
Definitely. It's obviously a significant, sizable majority for Boris Johnson, the biggest that the Conservatives have held since 1987. And you're right, the opposition will be in disarray. Labour will need to take time to reflect. And that this isn't just simply a process of who's going to replace Jeremy Corbyn as leader. It's a battle for the heart and soul of the Labour Party. It's very reflective of the sorts of battles that we saw in the late 1980s, following on from Michael Foot's defeat in 1983. And as we know, it took 14 years before the Labour Party moved back to the centre-left to allow Tony Blair to romp to power in 1997. So that there is an existential fight for what the Labour Party stands for. We've already said that they are traditionally the party of the working class. The working class feel betrayed. How do Labour move on now? Do they want to reclaim the working class? If they do, how can they do that? Or are they happy to try and position themselves as a metropolitan, progressive, southern, city-based political party that doesn't necessarily care about the northern heartlands anymore? It's something that the Labour Party really need to ask questions about that won't be solved simply by who the next leader is. It's a battle for what the Labour Party stands for, what the Labour Party sees itself as, and what sort of supporters it seeks as well.
Just when you think you can't get any more peak Brexit, you have a general election and you get even more peak Brexit. Gemma, thank you so much. That was Gemma Looms up in Staffordshire. And thank you as well to our other two guests. They were Kevin Craig and Giles Kenningham. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also follow us on Twitter. We're at AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet me. I will tweet you back. I'm at Peter Dobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the team here in London at the Shard. Thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.